All right. Good evening, everyone. We thank you all for joining us for our discussion this evening and presentation on what Jim Crow cost my family. My name is Nkosi Lee. I was a member of what was once called the Spirit Council and is now evolved, transformed, morphed into the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Council. But we're part of a team that started the Simsbury Let's Talk, and we were having conversations, and this was during COVID, and so we were just having, very important conversations around different topics, reflecting diversity, equity, and inclusion, and just trying to give a platform for discussion. And so what was started on one level has now evolved, and now with obviously the lifting of COVID and now having the ability to meet in person, that is why we are here this evening. And so again, we just like to thank all of you for joining us as well. And so just to give a little acknowledgement to the team, the Simsbury Diversity, Equity, Inclusion team. And from the Spirit Council, I see Nicole Kodak is here. Cheryl is here. Brady? Cheryl? Cook, thank you. Okay, Brady. Cheryl Cook. That's a pastor, Cheryl Brady. Sorry. Cheryl Cook. Carol is here as well. Flanagan and Sarah. I saw Sarah Batchelder as well. Sarah, where are you sitting? All right, yeah. So it's always a pleasure for myself to see many familiar faces all over again. And then we are been able to, change and expand. And so there's new members. And tonight we're going to hear from Cassie Taylor, and she's able to deliver a very powerful message about Jim Crow. I enjoy history. I teach social studies. So very often it's, a historical perspective. Obviously is a big push to use primary documents and primary sources now. And so this is what this is. So her family is a living history, a living testimony, and her family's experiences to the impact of Jim Crow on one family. And so you can perhaps picture how this has impacted one family. Then we can perhaps be able to picture what it did do to millions of people and millions of families as well. But this is a stellar presentation with a lot of who's who, in Black history, and a lot of names that I enjoy studying or enjoy talking about. Her family has had like firsthand encounter with. And so the presentation, the stories, the anecdotes are very, very poignant, and they're very, very powerful. And so that's what we're just here to talk about, make this a learning experience, make this an opportunity for discussion. There will be time at the end to be able to hopefully ask some questions, or if there's any points that you would like to make, just to be able to continue to make this a little bit more interactive. Is that okay? All right. And so this is obviously Black History Month, which started off as Negro History Week in February under the father of Black history is Carter G. Woodson. And February was chosen because it was celebrating the birthdays of Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass. And so that's why Black History Month was Black Negro History Week. And then I believe it was President Gerald Ford expanded it to Black History Month. And so since 1976, this is how it's been celebrated. And so it's always a time just to acknowledge, a specific time to acknowledge the achievements, the accomplishments, the obstacles, just the contributions of African Americans to America and how America has become. It's almost like, a misnomer just to leave this portion of American history to emphasize it in February. But every step of the way, from the French and Indian War to the Revolutionary War, every step of the way, there have been African Americans, people of color, people from Africa that have contributed to the fabric of American society and allowed this country to become exactly what it is. But at least in that aspect, this is a month, hopefully, to be able to emphasize some of the individuals and the many, many accomplishments and achievements that African Americans have contributed to this country. And so I enjoy this month. And as a history teacher, it's my responsibility to incorporate these individuals into American history as well. And so 1986, Congress passes the law and National Black History Month, making it into law. And so Carter G. Woodson, he has a book, The Miseducation of the Negro, where he just really, really lays into the groundwork of why it's important to have history also from a Black perspective as well, to be able to highlight those contributions and achievements throughout history. Oh yeah, we got the picture of, I believe that's Peter Salem right there, and he fired the shot in the Revolutionary War that killed Major John Pitcairn from the British. And that's the Battle of Bunker Hill. And so tonight, part of our point of emphasis is ice creams. Our presenter and her family, some of their favorite food is ice cream, and talking about something that is a part of the American fabric. And I had no idea that the father of ice cream was an African-American man, Augustus Jackson, and the patent for the ice cream scooper is also from another African-American man, Alfred Crowley. And so these are two individuals that are highlighted. There's flyers, a little pictograph also about them in the back. There's also ice cream from Frisbee's, which is a Black-owned ice cream store. They have 3 locations, but their main one is in New Britain. They've given ice cream for tonight. So, at the end of the presentation and the discussion, please feel free to grab a little bit of ice cream. Who doesn't like ice cream, right? So go and make sure you get some. And these are other points of emphasis. And also there's tickets. So there's tickets available, I believe, for the first 70 people who sign up. And they're going to have a special screening on Sunday at the Apple Cinemas here in Simsbury. And they're based on the book Cast. And then Ava DuVernay has made a movie called Origin. So there's going to be a special screening Sunday from 2 to 4. And so if you're here, you can get your tickets, and then you can have a free screening to see the movie as well. So it's a great time. Hollywood, Netflix, Amazon Prime, YouTube, TV, even more so than Hollywood, but there's so many different avenues and vehicles now for these stories to come out that perhaps can bypass Hollywood a little bit, but it's still there for our viewing pleasure. So it's really a great time for this type of different diversity that we're looking for in representation in films, in movies, and in books. And so now is a great time to be able to explore, a lot of stories. And so perhaps this is a very powerful story relating to, American history, and not just caste system in America, but also in India and places such as Germany as well. But talking about caste and how a structure has been put in place, which has created a lot of stereotypes. It's closed a lot of, people's minds, and then how do we challenge these stereotypes to break through the various levels of caste that we do have. So this is just what we're gonna be getting into a little bit tonight. I'm just here to introduce the speaker, introduce the topic as well. And so tonight we're gonna hear from Cassie Taylor and What Jim Crow cost my family. So the next voice you're going to hear is from Cassie. So please, let's give her a round of applause.
All right, can everybody hear me? Is this okay? Thank you all for coming out here tonight. Just going to go through a few slides here to this. So let's address the elephant in the room. For those who don't know me, I look completely white, yes? So historically in America, Blackness has been defined by what's called the one-drop rule. My family is mixed race for generations. We are like a rainbow, as you can see. It's my father's side who is Black. Unfortunately, because of the realities of things such as enslavement, I am a product of some pretty horrible things like rape, that have led to us being mixed for generations. But this is my family up here. They have identified as Black. It's not until more recently that we've been able to identify as how I identify, biracial. My mom is the beautiful, over here, 1980s white woman with a perm, Terry. She's also wearing the, in the second picture, she's next to me wearing the flower. She is the first white person in my family lines that isn't in my family lines under questionable circumstances. Let's put it that way. And those are my sisters. Jean in the middle picture is on the left, and Kathleen, she's the oldest, she's on the right. I'm going to try to move here fast because there is a lot of information. So I actually look a lot like my father's father. His name was John Aubrey Davis Sr. And he presented like I do, blue eyes, fair skin, unlike my father, who presents as a lighter skinned African American. And my grandfather did a lot of civil rights work, and one organization he worked with, and he was actually a founder of, was called AMSAC, the American Society of African Culture. And he met James Baldwin. And James Baldwin, does everybody know who James Baldwin is here? I just want to get a gauge. Okay. If you don't, he was a Black queer activist and writer. And he wrote about meeting my grandfather at this conference that took place in Paris when my grandfather was starting AMSAC. And he wrote, the chief of the delegation, John Davis, was to be asked just why he considered himself a Negro. He was to be told that he certainly did not look like one. He is a Negro, of course, from the remarkable legal point of view, which obtains in the United States. But more importantly, as he tried to make clear to his interlocutor, he was a Negro by choice and by depth of involvement, by experience, in fact. So I just felt that that was an important place to start, is talking about how, you know, there's such a thing as colorism. I'm on the fairer side. I'm often, what I like to say is white assumed. There's something called passing. Some people historically who are Black but fairer skin have tried to pass as white so that they didn't have to deal with a lot of discrimination. I don't try to pass. I'm just often white assumed because of the way that I look. I identify as a biracial American, Black and white. This is part of my family tree, and it's where I'm going to start with the family tree, because I'm going to talk to you today about my grandfather's family, and that really starts at his parents. And his parents, his father was, down at the bottom, John A. Davis. That stands for John Abraham Davis. And John Abraham Davis was the result of a Black maid around the time of the Civil War named Carolyn Gaskins. Then Davis, she married a man by the last name of Davis, and then she married again Chin. So she was really Carolyn Gaskins Davis Chin. And she and her employer, James M. Carlisle, who was an abolitionist lawyer and president of the bar in D.C., he was an advisor to Abraham Lincoln, represented Spain and Colombia here in the United States. They had a child together after his first wife died. That child was my great-grandfather, John Abraham Davis. Even though he considered himself an abolitionist, he would not publicly acknowledge my great-grandfather. He offered to pay for her schooling and everything, and my great-grandfather said, nope, want nothing to do with you. He took his mom's former married name of Davis, and he had a half-brother who was Charles Davis through his mom. Then there's Gabrielle Beale, who she presented as white. Her mother was Mary Jane Shoemate, who was half white and half Black. Her Father and mother were an interesting case. They lived together on a farm in Virginia, even though her father was white and her mother was black. She got together with William Beale, who was a lot older than her. He was a Confederate soldier. He had 5 children with her, and what the family describes in documents, I'm not going to say the word because I don't feel comfortable saying it, but they described him as an N-word hater. So here's a guy who's a Confederate soldier having 5 kids with a black woman. The family did not take his last name of Beale until after he died. They took Shoemate, and then they started using Beale until then. So that's something that I imagine kind of drew John Abraham and Gabrielle together, is they both were the result of illegitimate relations between black women and white men and didn't have relationships with their fathers. So then John Abraham and Gabrielle had 3 children. They had William Boyd Allison Davis over here on the left. They had Dorothy Davis, who did get married once, never had children, my Aunt Dot, to a man by the last name of Lucas. And then my grandfather, John Aubrey Davis. And this just shows their lines. My grandfather married Mavis Wormley. Wormley was a very prominent black bourgeoisie family in Washington, D.C. There's a hotel that used to exist that you can look up online if you want to learn more about the Wormleys. And Allison married twice, and his first wife, and the one he had children with, was Elizabeth Stubbs. And she's important because Allison and Elizabeth, if you go and you sign up for the tickets to see Origin, they are covered. Part of their story is covered in Origin. And Aunt Liddy, as we called her, was a researcher on caste with her husband. She never got her degree in anthropology, but she did study anthropology. I feel it's important as a woman to note that she ended up having kids with my Uncle Allison, so her work as an anthropologist took a backseat to the home, but she still needs to be acknowledged for the important work that she contributed in the way she helped her husband, especially in this historic study on caste that you all will learn about. Just so you know, just a little bit further, Allison had a son named Allison, and then also my cousin Gordon. Gordon, I know some people in here know, he was the first Black Parks Commissioner in New York City. He founded jazz at the Lincoln Center. He's a well-known guy and really wonderful, very active today. Oh, and then there's my dad, John Aubrey Davis Jr., and then Smith W. Davis, Smith Wormley Davis is my uncle. So this just kind of shows the lines further down, shows, you can see me over there. I'm the youngest of three girls. God bless my father. I always say, I don't know what you did when you were younger to break hearts, but it must have been something bad to have 3 daughters. And yeah, this is just the overview of my family. So we're going to start with John Abraham Davis. He was married before he married my great-grandma Gabrielle. He fought in the Spanish-American War. He was sent home with typhoid fever, and not long after, his first wife and his daughter died of scarlet fever, I believe it was. He began working in 1882 for the government printing office, making $500 a year, and then married Gabrielle in 1894. And in the early 1900s, they were riding high. My family has these beautiful Tiffany glasses that had like D for Davis on them that he had done. He owned a number of properties. He owned a farm in Virginia, was not popular with the Southern whites because he was voting in Virginia with this farm that he owned. He owned a number of properties in Washington, D.C., some laundries. He was able to accumulate wealth, which was pretty wonderful because he does come from slave lines way back when. They had their first child, my Uncle Allison, in 1902, followed by my Aunt Dot. And then 10 years after Uncle Allison was my grandfather, John Aubrey Sr. And by 1906, John Abraham had worked his way up to a supervisor in the clerking department for the government, making $1,400 a year. And he oversaw 9 white employees and 1 black employee, which is huge for an African-American man. Then Woodrow Wilson is elected president. Woodrow Wilson, if you don't know, I think most people do, there is a KKK movie called Birth of a Nation, and he is known for showing it in the White House. He's pretty blatantly racist, and he put in a bunch of appointees in the government who started imparting Jim Crow policies. And what I'm about to tell you happened to my great-grandfather didn't just happen to him, it happened to many other black employees in the government at the time. We have the data that exists, my family does. We work with a gentleman, Eric Yellen. He's in academics and who was able to get the employment files from the government. And it's sad. A lot of African Americans were demoted, which is what happened to my great-grandfather. His wages were diminished. And by Woodrow Wilson came into office in 1913, so my grandfather was a year old. By 1914, his wages had been diminished back down to what he was making 25 years earlier, $500. Now he has an almost 2-year-old child at home and 2 older children as well. The family has to then, the properties that they owned in DC, many of them were mortgaged, and they were letting other family members live in those properties and just kind of like pay the mortgage. My great-grandfather wasn't trying to make money off of them. He was trying to help his community. So he had to sell those properties, unfortunately. Wanted to keep the family farm. 2 issues with doing that. Bank wouldn't give him a loan because he was black. Number 2, remember how I said he was voting down at his farm in Virginia? Well, the KKK didn't like that. So the KKK was harassing him and harassing the workers on the farm. And so this actually is a picture that sits in my parents' dining room of the public sale of basically he had to do a fire sale and sell the farm for bits and pieces. Otherwise, he was just going to lose it entirely. I should also mention here Senator William Boyd Allison. He's important because that's how my Uncle Allison and my cousin Allison got their name. He had been a champion for John Abraham in the federal government and would write to his supervisors and say, you really need to look at this guy, and he's doing such a good job. He was a senator from Iowa, and he helped my great-grandfather move along in his career. But he died in 1908 before Wilson became president, and he had nobody to champion for him anymore once Wilson was in there. As a result of selling all the properties, the family kept one property on S Street. I believe it's 933 S Street in Washington, D.C. And in order to pay the mortgage for that, they had to take in boarders. Many times it was family members that had been kicked out of the homes that they had to sell. And my Uncle Allison at age 11 had to go to work as an elevator boy. And I am one of those moms that when my kids are complaining about something, I'm like, you're lucky. You're 10 years old. At age 11, your Uncle Allison was working as an elevator boy. You better appreciate the things you have. So this is a picture of my Uncle Allison when he was at a school called M Street School, which then became known as Dunbar. Do people know what Dunbar is? We have a reference sheet. Dunbar was a very prominent school in Washington, D.C. for African Americans. Carter G. Woodson, who is referenced when we were talking about Black History Month, was one of the teachers there. It had an excellent teaching staff because of racism. Many very well-educated Black people could not get jobs at the elite universities where they should be teaching. And so they ended up teaching at Dunbar School. So it was a school that if Maryland, over the line in Maryland or over the line in Virginia, it was based in DC, it was a public school, you would try to find a family member who has an address that could get your kid into being at Dunbar and try to like push them in there and be like, oh yeah, we live at this address, because the education was so good. So I'll talk more about that in a second, but regarding Allison watched everything that happened to his dad, because my grandfather never remembered a life of having things. To him, he only remembered his family's life of being poor. Allison remembered what they had and saw what they lost, because he was 10, 11 years old. And he actually wrote a story that I'm going to read you really quickly. There's a note on this. I've been going through my grandfather's documents in Washington, D.C. My grandfather and, as you're about to find out, Allison were both, big civil rights leaders and academic Black activists. And so Allison wrote about what happened to their family. And he wrote, "Dear John, I wrote the account of Papa's being discharged and added the rest this year. You were just a few months old." In this, he changes some names. King stands for Allison, and he changed Gabrielle's name to, there's only one female in here. Whatever female is brought up is supposed to represent his mother, Gabrielle. And John Abraham is Johnny. King's father was an idealist. He trusted life and had faith in the better side of human beings. But his mother was cut to a different pattern. She trusted neither life nor those who, she felt, controlled it. In the face of injustices and to defend her children, she would fight like a tigress. She never bowed in spirit, but stood her ground against the whole system of white power. In doing so, she taught King, Allison, that injustice had to be met by the same stubborn refusal to be broken, which life itself demands. For she was a Stoic. She believed the whole course of the universe was blind, without providence or justice, a matter of pure chance. Self-pity, therefore, was foolish. She had been born and reared on the flint rocks and red clay of central Virginia. From the hard land, she had learned to face the basic realities of life: work, pregnancy, disease, the battle to survive. Twice near death from malaria and typhoid fever, she had survived without a physician. None of her family had had the services of a physician, a midwife, or an undertaker. Alive, sick, or dead, they took care of themselves and fought and endured. Marge Victor, that's supposed to be Gabrielle, had tried to teach King, Allison, it was useless to feel put upon because he had been born Black. For the conditions of her life and his life had been determined before they were born. They had been set by the universe through the laws of chance. They had no relation to justice, fairness, or mercy, which were man-made ideals. The universe itself was cold, impersonal, and made no promises. It set the same terms for every species, including man. If the terms appeared merciless, it was one's self-pity which made them seem so. Therefore, a strong man, she taught King, had to hold his head up and run his course against the bastard life so as to keep his self-respect against injustice, against mischance, against whatever had to be faced. And in the end, one faced death as one had faced life by standing up to it. Sometimes Marge seemed cynical, especially after her husband's destruction. But at heart, she was, like most farm people, a Stoic. King sometimes thought of his mother as stronger than his father, but actually, she was depressed. She always turned to John Victor, which is supposed to be John Abraham, for hope and reassurance. Until King's father had been crushed by whites, he had been a vigorous and high-spirited man. Johnny had faith in men. He believed a man could learn his way out of his own anger and blindness. In response to his faith, His friends would try their best around him. Their faces would light up, and for a time, they would believe in life again. King discovered that his father had an ever rarer ability. He could forgive, actually give up the desire for revenge, and renew his faith in the frightened, vengeance-minded, embittered human animal. Unlike his son, John Victor believed with all his heart in the good instincts of white men. He felt that most of them possessed his own desire to act justly and to deal mercifully. He had, indeed, some evidence to justify his faith. For 21 years, he had been chief of 12 white accountants in the Baltimore office of the United States Department of Justice. So again, some details changed just a tiny bit. But in 1951, King had seen his father cut down by one of the many Southern whites who had moved into Baltimore. Rebel raiders, his mother called them. After World War II, they had taken federal offices by storm, and by 1950, they occupied most of the higher posts. And Marge began urging her husband to find another job before it was too late. But Johnny had continued to believe in white justice until 1952. In March of that year, a white man from Leesburg, Virginia, became chief of the accounting division and immediately discharged all blacks. Johnny had to clean out his desk and leave within the week. King saw his father return home early that day. He saw the stricken look on his face. Johnny kept repeating the story as if unable to understand or accept it. "They've kicked me out," he shouted in hurt and indignation. "Kicked me out after 21 years, like a dog without a bone. With nothing, not even a clerk's job. By God, I've got 4 children to feed and try to educate. What in God's name can there be their justification?" His father had tried to relight his pipe, but his hand kept shaking. "Justification," his mother said cynically. "Justification? They don't need any justification. They'll never care if you slave all your life. Or if we go without a crust of bread. If all of us, children and mothers included, starved like dogs, John, I give you my word, white people wouldn't care. They'd think it good riddance." King still remembered his mother's sobs and his father's efforts to reassure her. That day, for the first time, he realized his father was too gentle. He'd never get another good job. It was the end of the line for them all. The next evening, the Black Savings Society board met in the dining room. Mr. Taylor, the secretary, tried to reconcile King's father to white injustice. "John, what can you do? We know white people will grind us into the dirt. We're nothing to them, just something to be walked on and thrown aside like an old shoe." But his father would not resign himself. Speaking in a voice which King feared might break, he protested, "Gentlemen, I give you my word of honor, I've never stolen a cent, not even when we had little or nothing to eat during the Depression. But for my children," yes, King knew his father's voice would break, "I tell you, by God, for my children, I would steal. By my sacred word of honor, I would steal to feed them." King was shaken to hear his father say such a thing, although he knew, of course, his father would never steal. How his hand trembled as he raised it to emphasize his oath, how his poor words ran together, how terrible his humiliation. King never forgot the maiming and crushing of his father. The terrible wounds seared into King's mind and heart forever, burning in everlasting hatred of whites. But his father did not allow his personal misfortune to embitter him. He threw himself into a search for work and walked the streets of Baltimore and Washington from morning to night. Every want ad specified white only, but Johnny faithfully answered them all, driving himself without mercy, looking, hoping. But he discovered that white only meant exactly what it said. 3 months later, he asked help of his white friends in justice, and they got him a job as a messenger. During those 3 months, King had watched his father return home, his knees sagging, his eyes wide with disaster. King made up his mind then to trust no white man and to work harder than ever on his books. He piled them on his elevator stool and studied each night until midnight, grimly enduring the ridicule of his white passengers. June of the following year, 1954, he graduated first in his class and received a tuition scholarship to a white New England college, where his father hoped he could escape the white injustice which had ruined his own life. I read all this because it's basically all true in the story of what happened to my Uncle Allison. So he threw himself into his studies, and he graduated as valedictorian of M Street School / Dunbar, as it became to be known. And Allison got a scholarship to a little New England college known as Williams College in Massachusetts. But unfortunately, racism wasn't much better in the North. I know we like to pride ourselves on, hey, we are the North, you know, we were against slavery, but I think it's also important to be honest about what the situation was like back then. My uncle was not allowed to reside in the dorms. He had to reside in a boarding house. He had to get a job serving white students out of fraternity and washing their dishes in order to eat. My great uncle also dealt with just, you know, experiences of racism in the social structure, financial aid office, and his interactions with people. And he was, even despite all that, he was a pretty popular student. He excelled in academics, became leader of the Pipe and Quill Academic Writing Club. It's funny because he actually, in one of their meetings, he had to serve all of them as part of his job. So he had food to eat at Williams, and then took off his like serving apron and then sat down and helped lead the meeting of this pen and quill club. And he, despite the instances and everything against him, he graduated as valedictorian. And when he went to give his speech, he was nervous that his classmates were not going to stand up. And begrudgingly, many did. But after his speech, his father told him, good job, but said, Allison, I wish you would have told me about the racism you're enduring up here. Allison then goes on to get for higher education. I'll try to move through this fast. He goes to Harvard for a year. He had majored in English at Williams. His master program was also in English at Harvard. He graduated at the top of his class, had similar experiences with racism at Harvard, and then reached out to the president of William, who was the son of President Garfield, who had been assassinated. One of his sons became president of Williams, and he had a relationship with him, and he asked him for a teaching position. So this is a man who is educated at Williams, graduated valedictorian of Williams, graduates top of his class at Harvard, and the Williams President Garfield says, no, there's too many Southerners here who might be offended by having you be a teaching assistant. Allison never forgot that. So about a year later, he reached out again. His father had died in that time. My grandfather was in high school. My Aunt Dot was at Wellesley, and reaches out to President Harry Garfield of Williams again, this time about teaching at Hampton Institute, which is a Black vocational school very similar to Tuskegee in the South. He had to help support his family now. So he really needed a job. So for a man with his education, it was kind of a lowly for him to be teaching at Hampton Institute, much like it was lowly for the wonderful teachers at Dunbar School to be teaching there. They should have been teaching somewhere else because they were so well educated. So teaching at Hampton Institute somewhat influenced his decision to work on a study about caste that I'll talk about. And it's also where he met a student who became his mentee named St. Clair Drake. Raise your hand if you know what caste is. Okay. Let's say, raise your hand if you don't know what caste is. Okay, I will go over this. A caste system is like a hierarchy. And the best way is described actually by Isabel Wilkerson, I think, who wrote the book Caste, is it encapsulates all the isms, racism, sexism, all of those sorts of things. And it can be In America, we've got class is one way that our caste system exists. Your gender, are you straight? Are you LGBTQ plus? Are you black, white, Jewish, and immigrant? All those things play into it here. So at the top of the pyramid would be white, rich males. And at the bottom would be, let's just say, poor black people, poor black females. In the middle, you're going to have, as you can see, there's, I put wealthy, white collar, blue collar, and it's also going to vary by different races in America. Like you could have those that are Latino above being black or Asian, but they're still below white people. So it's a whole hierarchy system. And it doesn't just exist in the United States. If you haven't read Caste and you do go see Origin, you will see that they talk about two other specific caste systems that exist. One in India and one in Nazi Germany, where obviously we know what happened to the Jewish population. And they based their caste system off of the U.S. caste system and decided, you'll see this in the movie, they pull out all the documents, and Isabel flew to Germany and went through the notes of the Nazi lawyers when they were coming up with their caste system, and they felt that some of the American laws were too harsh to include in Nazi Germany. Some of the things that we were doing to Black people and minorities were too harsh for the Nazis. And they said, no, we can't get away with this. We can't put it in there. And it's crazy because we know millions of Jewish people were killed in that short period of time. We don't know how many Black people have been killed. You have to think about Middle Passage. You have to think about the hundreds of years of enslavement, Jim Crow, the things that honestly go on today, Trayvon Martin. We don't know how many have been killed by our caste system. And this isn't to say one is worse than the other, because you can't compare them. They're both awful. But it's to make a point that if Nazis think that your laws are like too harsh, maybe have a little bit of a problem. So anyway, my Uncle Allison meets, while he's teaching at Hampton Institute, Elizabeth Liddy Stubbs, my Aunt Liddy. Unfortunately, she died before I could meet her. She died in 1969 of cancer. And they left Hampton Institute to go get anthropology degrees. On his path to his doctorate, Allison went to Harvard, London Institute of Economics, and the University of Berlin, where he observed the beginnings of the Nazis' rise to power, which is, I want to read another quick passage from a book called The Lost Black Scholar on my Uncle Allison. And it says, even more frustrating, Davis's tutelage under Dietrich Westermann in Berlin in the spring of 1933 was cut short as Adolf Hitler took dictatorial control of Germany, arresting communists, dissolving trade unions, and Nazifying the press and universities. Davis later recalled, I was a student in Berlin when Hitler came to power. I saw the Nazis burn the books, throw the liberal youth and teachers in jail, and close the University of Berlin to all minority groups. I saw the brown shirts attacking the students, the professors, and the anti-Nazis, all in the name of patriotism. Making the matter more personal, Davis observed how one of his good friends in Berlin, a Jew named Rudy, was ordered to sever his relations with his Aryan girlfriend. The two refused and risked their lives by continuing to date in secret. Davis was impressed with their stoical resolve, and he identified with the struggle against an implacable racist foe. After having witnessed the devastating effects of a racism that was clearly global in nature, he and Elizabeth fled back to London as determined as ever to fight racial injustice. So they go on, they decide they're going to study to be anthropologists in the end, like I told you guys earlier, Liddy never got her degree because she became devoted to raising their children when they had children. What happens in becoming anthropologists? Well, they are grad students. A white anthropologist named Lloyd Warner decides he wants to direct a study on caste, studying the Deep South, specifically in Natchez, Mississippi. He recruits Allison and Liddy, and Allison is the lead. He's a black man, and he's the lead researcher on the study, which is huge because there was a white couple, Mary and Burley Gardner, who were also part of it. So they went undercover in the South. Allison and Liddy as a black couple, and Mary and Burley as a white couple, just kind of like investigating this community and investigating the caste system and the social norms and the social rules and how you had to interact. And they did that for 2 years. The third year, they went and they realized with the caste system, we're missing a whole area. We're missing what happens to like the sharecropper blacks, so the lower tier black, because being lighter skin, often many people end up being more of like a middle class or a middle upper class for, being black back then. And so he recruited St. Clair Drake, his old student, to come and go undercover as a sharecropper so that they could study lower class blacks as well in this big study. It becomes a book. You can get the book today. It was recently re-released with a foreword by Isabel Wilkerson called Deep South that goes over everything that they saw in Natchez. It was very dangerous. People became suspicious of my Uncle Allison. He kept a gun in his car. He could have been lynched for doing what he was doing. But he felt it was very important. The reason I bring all this up, and this is called What Jim Crow Cost My Family, is the point that obviously my family hit a bottom, but they took what happened to them and everything that my Uncle Allison does with his research and as an academic, and everything that I'll tell you that my grandfather did can be tied all the way back to what they experienced in their youth. I know Allison was there's a black bourgeoisie, so like an upper class blacks in Washington, D.C. at the time. My grandmother's family, as I mentioned, was part of the black bourgeoisie. They were the Wormleys, and they didn't want to rock the boat because they had wealth and they were able to like work with the whites, and so they didn't really fight for lower class black people way back then. And so when his family lost everything, Allison gained a big disdain for the black bourgeoisie, and it also created in him an interest to study these hierarchies, these class systems, these racial systems that exist. So that explains his interest in caste here. And I think you'll understand when I talk about my grandfather soon why his path became what his path was. So Allison goes on and becomes an anthropologist, does more work, does a study children of bondage with John Dollard, another anthropologist, and it's studying the like educational opportunities and social opportunities and the way they impact the development of poor black Southern student.
I'm a little concerned that I'm missing it.
That's my husband. So this is, I just thought I'd throw this in here so you guys can see, because if you go see Origin, you'll see Allison and Liddy. On the left is Uncle Allison with my cousin Allison as a baby. Over on the right is my grandfather, Peggy, my cousin Gordon's wife, Lizzie, my cousin Lizzie, who is Allison's granddaughter, and Allison's on the right as they're older. So during Children of Bondage, Allison received a fellowship at Yale. In 1939, he enrolled at the University of Chicago's PhD program for anthropology Dollard, who was white, was offered teaching positions at Harvard despite his lack of degrees, something not allotted to Allison. In 1942, after receiving his PhD, Allison received a 3-year assistant professorship at the University of Chicago. But to make that happen, it had to happen with the support of the Rosenwald Fund, which was like a fund that actually gave grants to a lot of prominent African Americans. It was like Julian Bond, if you know who he was. He was one of the founders of Southern Poverty Law and a president of the NAACP, said that the academic blacks of the 1930s and 40s were like the who's who of Black people, researchers, and they're the ones that typically got the Rosenwald grants. So they pushed to get, I'm not having this meeting. They pushed to get him this 3-year assistantship, and then even more so, they pushed to get him to be tenured. And they do that by supplementing some of his pay. They promised the university that because of course, the president is nervous because of race relations at the time, of the optics of taking some of the university money and giving it to support a Black professor. So in 1947, he becomes a full tenure in 1947, full professorship in 1948, and he became the first tenured Black professor at the University of Chicago and at a predominantly white university, which is pretty dang awesome. And he continued his research in anthropology and really greatly focused on education. He created his own IQ test. He is credited with being the guy who discovers the bias in standardized testing that exists. And his work is what was used as the foundation for creating Head Start program and affirmative action. And it was also used in Brown versus the Board of Education, which we will talk about when we get to my grandpa. I had to put the picture in the middle in because I knew my grandfather as a grandfather. He died when I was 19, I believe, and he was the best grandfather in the world. I loved him dearly. I regret that I wasn't old enough to know and appreciate him for who he was and the academic he was and the amazing things that he contributed to this society. But in that center picture, that's my mom's dad looking at us, and then I was in his arms. It was at one of his daughter's weddings. And then I saw my Grandpa Davis come up, and I freaked out and got so excited. And as you can see, I have a huge smile on my face. So it's one of my favorite pictures because it just shows how much I loved my grandfather innately. The difference between my grandfather and Allison, obviously 10-year age gap. One lived through the family having things and then those things being taken away. One never remembers his family having money. So they're born and experience different history of the family. Allison was more known to be very serious, kind of depressed, described by the family. If you ask anybody about my grandfather, he was known as the life of the party, the social one, like the one everybody wanted to talk to. Even Allison's kids were like, we adored your grandfather because he was just so fun and he was so great and so interactive. He also graduated as valedictorian at Dunbar, like his brother, got a scholarship to Williams. He was lighter skinned. His brother presented as Black. Grandpa would tell a story about, how he'd be on the bus with his brother and somebody would come up and say, hey, you can't sit back here. This is where Black people sit. And he'd be like, this guy is my brother. He's like, don't you tell me not to sit here. This is my brother. I am Black and we belong together. Allison, I should mention, also endured a lot of crazy stuff from his mother, Gabrielle. She was one who was willing to test the caste lines. So she would do things like take him into white-only department stores since she was passable and he was not. And then people would be like, ma'am, why did you bring a black child into the store? And then she'd rip them a new one and be like, this black child's my son. And well, yes, that's very great that she did that. It was very embarrassing and damaging for Allison. He writes in a lot of our family documents that we have about how it negatively impacted him and just as an adolescent, and he felt totally embarrassed. Same thing when they go on trains. People on trains would try to separate him and his father from my grandfather, their mother, and Aunt Dot, because Aunt Dot also presented as white. So anyway, being lighter skinned and being the fiery one out of the two, my grandfather does also experience racism at Williams, but he raises hell about it. And we have letters. I go back and forth to DC a lot to go through my grandfather's belongings with my uncle. And my uncle doesn't know where he put them. Otherwise, I would bring one out. But we have letters between President Garfield at Williams and Uncle Allison basically saying, what are we going to do about John? John is in here ranting and raving again the other day about, racism and this and that. And he's not wrong, but we got to get him under control. And Allison's trying to help with that and is trying to be the intermediary. And let's just say my grandfather's a passionate man. He graduates from Williams and at 21 years old comes back to Washington, D.C., which is facing a depression. The country's facing a depression. And he notices in his black neighborhood that the businesses that serve the black community but are owned by white people are firing the black workers and hiring white ones. And my grandfather was not about this, and he was like, we got to do something. And the NAACP and the black bourgeoisie is like, we don't want to rock the boat. We're not going to do anything. This isn't the way to go about it. And my grandfather, 21 years old, is like, all right, I'm going to do something about it. I'm going to start an organization. And he started an organization called the New Negro Alliance. And they picketed these businesses and started the peaceful Don't Buy Where You Can't Work campaign. And the first one was, I believe, is called the Hamburger Grill. And within days, they had gotten rid of those white workers. They rehired their black workers at higher wages and less hours. So they're like, great, this is working. And he gets a friend, Belford Lawson, who's a lawyer, to come and join, and a few other prominent black people at the time keep going around. They make these flyers. They're holding meetings, picketing places, and finally they get sued by a company called Sanitary Grocery Group, which is what we call Safeway today. So this case makes it all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States. Belford Lawson with the NAACP gets involved, and an assistant attorney for Lawson is a young man named Thurgood Marshall, who helps assist in it. And basically they won the case. And this case is important because there was a case on labor laws called LaGuardia. And it was basically allowed you to protest your employer and picket your employer over a labor dispute. And Safeway was saying, well, none of these people picketing us are employed by us, so they shouldn't be able to picket us. And this ruling says, no, you can picket any business you want, even if you don't work there, over a labor dispute. Uh-oh. I am not C. Carney. Okay. So allows us to picket any business we want over labor disputes. One person who goes to these meetings that my grandfather is holding is a gentleman named Ralph Bunche. Does anybody know who Ralph Bunche is? You can raise your hand. Okay, he's lesser known, but he's very important. He is the first African-American man to win the Nobel Peace Prize in 1950. He is the first black political scientist, and he's teaching at Howard at the time. And he doesn't agree with my grandfather's, peaceful protest methods, but he's very impressed with my grandfather and spends an evening after one of these meetings trying to convince him, John, you should not be an English major. You need to be in political science, and you need to be in government, and that's how you fight racism. And so basically, my grandfather then goes on to pursue an MA in International Relations and Comparative Politics at the University of Wisconsin. Comes back to DC after receiving his master's and teaches for Bunch at Howard for a while because Bunch has to go teach at Columbia for another professor on leave. And Bunch served several important roles in the UN. He was very, very involved, and he marched with King in 1963. He marched right next to him. What he won the Nobel Peace Prize for was for his work on negotiating peace in the Israel-Palestine conflict, which unfortunately is still going on today. And he was heavily involved in the work to decolonize Africa. So in 1936, my grandfather started teaching at Lincoln University. And he keeps going back and forth to teaching at Lincoln because Lincoln is experiencing cuts due to the war. And so the presidents of Lincoln are like, hey, if you can go find other work at the time, please go find other work because it's hard for us to pay our professors. In 1938, he gets his doctorate at Columbia in American government and constitutional law and a minor in labor economics, which is important because think about what happened to his father. Labor economics, constitutional law, American government. His father worked for the government. The wheels are rolling here. It's also important because of what happened to his father. I think that's why he became so enraged when he came home and saw what was happening to other black workers being shifted out of their jobs, which were already low paying, and white men getting those jobs. At Lincoln, he becomes close with one of the eventual university presidents, Horace Mann Bond. His son is Julian Bond, who I mentioned. My father grew up with Julian Bond. He decides, well, Allison doesn't like Williams. My grandfather is like, I want to make Williams better. And he decides to go sit on the Board of Regents and to help fight the status quo. And he also receives eventually an honorary degree from them. My grandfather's work involves, he is the assistant director of New York State Committee Against Discrimination Employment. Again, thinking back to what happened to his father. First such committee in the United States under Governor Herbert Lehman in New York. And he wrote a highly successful book on managerial techniques involved in fair employment. He was named director of FDR's Fair Employment Practices Committee. He was a consultant to the State Department in making their practices non-discriminatory. And it wasn't just for race. He also did a lot of work on ageism too. And then in 1953, he was appointed to the New York State Commission Against Discrimination under Governor Averell Harriman, and also advised JFK and Lyndon B. Johnson and wrote parts of their speeches when they were working on the Civil Rights Act of 1964. He advised them and helped with that. And he also worked with Robert F. Kennedy on civil rights work. And this is a picture of him with Harriman, I believe. And my father is the handsome teenage gentleman, and my Uncle Smitty is the younger one staring off into oblivion. And then that's my grandma Mavis, who is just absolutely gorgeous. But probably the capstone, the big thing, if you ask my grandpa, out of all of the projects he worked on, he'd probably say the biggest thing would be Brown versus the Board of Education. In the summer of 1953, Thurgood Marshall, who he became best friends with, asked him to lead the non-legal research team for the case as it was at SCOTUS. He had already argued the case at SCOTUS, and they came back with about 5 questions, the justices. And the thought was that, hey, they're asking these questions because they don't really want to rule in, in the favor with Brown versus the board. So maybe we can trip them up with these questions. questions. So my grandfather gets a team of researchers together, including Horseman Bond, Kenneth Clark, who did the doll test, the famous doll test, if you guys remember that on race, and actually uses the research of his brother as well on race, caste, and education that he has done. And it started over the summer, and I believe by fall they had a decision and they passed Brown versus the Board of Education because of the research that my grandfather's team was able to put together. I have a quick excerpt. I always think it's good to speak in their words when possible instead of my own. My grandfather wrote, "Undoubtedly, the watershed event for all American civil rights, including those of the American Negro, was the Supreme Court's decision in Brown versus Topeka. During the summer and into the fall of 1953, I directed the non-legal research for the NAACP's brief in answer to the court's questions for re-argument of Brown, questions about the intent with regard to segregation in education of those who framed, proposed, and adopted the 14th Amendment, and questions about the powers of the court and the Congress under the amendment. That work and the unanimous decision in Brown in 1954 remain as the most satisfying events in the course of my life's work. But in addition, I was able to follow up through service on the board and the executive committee of the NAACP's Legal Defense Fund during 15 years of judicial and legislative civil rights progress in support of voting rights in the South." So this is huge because Brown versus the Board of Education obviously was basically what undid Plessy versus Ferguson. And now I tie these two together. You remember the New Negro Alliance, right? And then now there's Brown versus the Board of Education. Without these two rulings, a little event known as the Montgomery bus boycotts don't happen. Because when they first do the Montgomery bus boycotts, they base it as a labor dispute when they start picketing. They say, we want you to hire black drivers and, pay them better and give them better wages. But then they changed their strategy and made it about, well, we don't want you to segregate us. So then they switched it to that way. They used both strategies. They used the NNA ruling and they used Brown versus the Board of Education, which undid Plessy versus Ferguson as their basis for those boycotts. And this on this page is just a picture of my grandparents at one of their anniversary parties with Thurgood Marshall that I have in my possession. And this is a letter that my grandfather wrote that I have a picture of to his brother saying that, hey, this has been a success. Our non-legal research was vindicated and we used your work on the caste system. And so, yeah, just to Dr. Allison Davis from John A. Davis, Director, Non-Legal Research. Bunch's influence on my grandfather led him to believe that no one is free until we are all free. So my grandfather then starts to feel passionate about fighting for equality in Africa and decolonization. At Lincoln, he had taught the first Ghanaian president, Kwame Nkrumah, who becomes a mentee, and they share a lifelong relationship until Nkrumah's death. And he actively becomes more involved in Africa by founding, as I had mentioned before, AMSAC, the American Society of African Culture, in 1956. And he was the executive director. Before I read this passage, that in the middle there is Duke Ellington, is the Duke. And my grandfather and grandmother are on the right. Nina Simone was part of this. It was a cultural exchange between Africans and African Americans to help them really appreciate their shared culture. Langston Hughes was also involved. Thurgood Marshall was one of the founders. It was really a pretty cool thing. And so this is what my grandfather had to say on AMSAC. Although I had studied European and African relations under Grayson Kirk at Wisconsin and had learned from Bunch when I taught for him at Howard University in 1935, and although I had taught African students, including Kwame Nkrumah at Lincoln University, my active involvement in the affairs of the African continent began only in 1956. In September of that year, I led the American delegation to the now famous, this is in French, but it's basically that place where, that, remember the quote from James Baldwin, that conference where they met. Out of that meeting, an International Society Africaine de Culture was formed, and within a year, an American Society of African Culture, which I headed. The latter organization, which was composed of American Negro scholars, writers, artists, and musicians, was devoted to the cultural identity and contributions of Africans and Americans of African descent. Both the newly emerging African and the newly emerging American Negro needed such efforts for their own benefit and for those who came to know their presence for the first time. Moreover, the struggles of the African and the American Negro for freedom were mutually reinforced. Sorry about that. My national and international efforts spanned from the years from 1956 to 1968. So that is, I could go into a lot more. I'm still learning so much more specifically about my grandfather, because he did a lot in a lot of areas, especially as it relates to discrimination and employment practices and civil rights. He was kind of all over the map. And I'm going through his papers today. But you can see the lines of how what happened in Jim Crow motivated both of them to go in the directions that they chose to go. While they used their trauma to improve the country and help break down caste and injustice, they also continue to carry that trauma with them. And I feel like this is a personal thing that I'm about to share, but I feel it's an important thing because I don't think it gets talked about too often. Allison was known as being serious, somewhat depressed, non-trusting of whites, and his side of the family is always identified as Black. Even Gordon, who I mentioned, the first Black Parks Commissioner of New York, he looks like I do. He's got blue eyes and everything, but identifies not as I do as a biracial. He identifies as Black, despite the fact that they are more often white assumed than my side of the family, because my dad presents as more Black than Gordon. That's Gordon over there with the glasses at Williams on the right. I'm there. My dad's next to me, and my Uncle Smitty's next to him. My grandfather, who was known as the boisterous, fun-loving, life of the party one, and how I knew him as like the best grandfather ever, would take me to go to McDonald's, would get me the chicken nuggets my mom would never get me because she said they were making chicken parts, would get me ice cream and take me to the railroad park, and made every single educational event, my plays, even though he lived in New York and I lived in Arizona at the time, was just always present, always found a way to be there. My Uncle Smitty called him growing up the monster. My father was convinced that they were so poor that they had to eat ketchup sandwiches. And my grandmother was like, that's not true, John. My dad's like, yeah, we were. We had to eat them, Mom. Like, I remember. And my grandma always told my dad and my uncle, I remember this, said, don't be like your father when it comes to money. Don't be so controlling over money. And she actually divorced him. Even though they loved each other, they had a weird relationship. They were about to get back together when my grandmother died, but she divorced him over that control and craziness over money. So he had this other side to him that only like the core group of people saw, and it's because of the trauma of the fact that he grew up poor and he had everything taken from him and he knew anything could be taken from him at any moment. So then I grew up with my father, the gentleman, in the purple baseball hat next to me. He becomes an ear, nose, and throat surgeon. Moves the family because of racism in his job in New York City, which is where he met my mother, to Scottsdale, Arizona, where he had other family, an uncle on his mom's side who was a doctor out there, Lowell Wormley, and chooses to raise us in a predominantly white area, even though we are, as a family, don't look like we fit in. I remember being in kindergarten and meeting another child who was tan and thinking, oh, I wonder if this child's like us. I wonder if this child's like my family, because I get really tan and I tan well. Maybe this child's mixed race and part black like me. He was not. He was from his family's from Eastern Europe or something. But I got so excited about the thought of that. Anyway, so my father, the surgeon, we grow up 2.5 acres in Scottsdale of land, have 3 horses. We have 3 dogs, German Shepherds, purebreds. We have 6 cats. I'm going to private school. And I'm convinced at any moment my family is going to go live at St. Vincent de Paul, which is the local homeless shelter, because my dad talks about that all the time. I believe we have no money, because my father is telling me all the time in our family that we can't afford this and we can't afford that. And my husband, who is right here, can attest, because my husband grew up more blue collar than I did. He thinks it's insane that I grew up with this mentality where I really believed we had nothing. Because when you go there and see my parents still live in the house, it's just how could you believe that? It's like you were brainwashed, and I was. And I remember there was a big, in 2008, stock market crash, and my parents lost a lot of money, in that. And my dad goes, oh, we lost X amount of money. And my mom and I look at each other and go, we had that much money? We really, we had no idea. And my parents have enough that there's trust set up for not only us, but for their grandkids. But my father is always afraid of losing it all, because his family had that happen. Once they had all this generational wealth, all these homes, these laundry businesses, and they lost it all. And that trauma was carried on from his father, the monster, who made them eat ketchup sandwiches, onto him, who, I'll tell you, it's amazing that my parents are still married, because there were lots of fights about money in that family. And my mom grew up very blue collar too, raised by a coal miner in Pennsylvania. To me, I've had to go to a lot of therapy to work out my own issues with, especially money and also race, because he chose to raise us in Scottsdale, which, if you're not familiar with Scottsdale, is a very white area. And it was very confusing for me and for my sisters to grow up in that area. My oldest sister was called the N-word on the bus. I was called an Oreo and a mutt growing up a lot, because people would see my dad and my sister and know that I wasn't just white. And I asked my dad, I said, why didn't you raise us in South Phoenix, where there's actual black community and where Uncle Lowell was? And I asked this to him once in front of my Uncle Smitty. And both of them were like, well, you never got a knife pulled on you at school, did you? No, that's why I raised you in Scottsdale. That's why. And Smitty's like, yeah, that was a smart decision. You didn't have to go through the violence and things that we did. And I go, okay, hold up. Obviously, there's some trauma here. I get it. I'm sorry you had those experiences. But in trying to protect me, you also passed on more trauma, because then I didn't know where I fit in. And I didn't know where our family fit in. And it was very confusing for me. And Kathleen was growing up in Scottsdale, my sister, who presents as black and is black assumed, dealing with issues of racism with nobody really to turn to but my father, who was working all the time. And I remember my uncle was like, oh, your generation, you have it so much better than us. And I think you guys are too soft sometimes in bringing these things up with, racism. I shared a story that somebody approached my somebody close to my husband approached him when we were engaged and saw a picture of my family and found out I'm biracial and said, "Are you sure you want to have kids with her? You could have black kids." And so my uncle, in talking about these experiences that have happened to me, he's like, "You're too soft today, you guys. We went through much, much more difficult things and had our lives threatened." And I said, "Uncle Smitty," and this was just over Christmas, we had this conversation. I said, "There was a kid within this past year who knocked on his neighbor's door, a black child, and was greeted by a white man with a gun. As long as situations like that are still happening in this country, we still need to be talking about even the microaggressions of race, because racism is not solved and the issues of violence are not over." And he did concede, thankfully, because I probably would have lost my mind if he didn't. But that's what Jim Crow cost my family. It wasn't just generational wealth. It was mental health and trauma as well. And I think it's important to bring that up. And that happened to a family like mine, where we are mixed. We are lighter skinned. Some of us are white assumed and could pass if we choose to. So this brings us back to the beginning. This is a picture on the farm before they sold it. The white looking woman was my great grandmother. The Teddy Roosevelt looking gentleman was my great grandfather, who loved Teddy Roosevelt and emulated him. This African American boy is Uncle Allison, and the others are like cousins, all mixed in, cousins and siblings. And today, there's the Davis Center at Williams. I hope to learn more as I go, because they're doing a rededication of the Davis Center. It's the Multicultural Center on April 12th, and named after my grandfather and my great uncle. And so the whole family will be together, and I'm still trying to find out more to the story, and I'm looking forward to doing that then. So in telling my story, like I said, this is just one family, and this is a family that is lighter skinned black. I want to celebrate all black people and all black families, and I hope you guys can take into account that if this is what we went through, think about all the other untold stories out there, especially by those, because colorism is a real thing, who the families may have been darker skinned than ours. There are so many stories to be told, and I hope this Black History Month you will take the time to research and learn about them. Thank you.
You say, thank you, Cassie, for sharing. I'm over here. We have a time, so we'd like to open the floor. So if anyone has any questions or comments, please feel free. Just raise your hand. We'll pass the microphone around, and you have have time to share or ask a question. So there's a lot of information that came forth, in that presentation. But maybe from one piece, if there's something you like to ask about, maybe expound about. But if there's something perhaps that struck your interest, or something you'd like to maybe know a little bit more about, now's the time to ask. So we still have a little bit of a space of time. So if anyone has any questions, please feel free. All right, we got one.
I don't think I need a mic, but I'll use the mic. In those letters, why did King?
Can you speak a little
What?
closer? I am hearing impaired and my hearing aids broke, so I apologize.
I have to apologize. Those letters you read about, King was Allison, and John Victor. Why did they have to change their names, or why didn't they use?
So Allison had started off as an English major, much like my grandfather, and he was actually one of I left this out, but the Harlem Renaissance, he was actually one of the poets of the Harlem Renaissance. So I think this was started off as one of his writing explorations, and like a thing he was using, like a prompt to get things out and to see where he wanted to go with a story. So I don't think it was to necessarily hide what the family had been through. You know what? He wrote it over a series of years. I know he started it probably when he was in college, but he didn't finish it until towards the end of his life. And that's when he sent it to my grandfather.
Yeah, we got another question in the back.
Hi, not necessarily a question, but more of a debt of gratitude, basically for Brown versus Board of Ed. So you talked about Plessy versus Ferguson, and for those of you who don't know, from the legal standpoint, Plessy versus Ferguson was the train car situation where a black man, Plessy, total setup. Many of the cases that make it to the Supreme Court are total setups. And sometimes they have to do them multiple times to get there. Plessy was one of them. But basically, he was a white-presenting black man who gets on the train. They've hired a detective, a private detective, who had arrest powers. And he's on the white train, and he's like, yeah, I'm black. Well, he doesn't quite say that, but everybody knows. He gets dragged off, he gets arrested, fined, convicted, all that stuff, and it makes it all the way up to the Supreme Court because somebody has to take the hit for you to be aggrieved to do that. The train car or the train folks, the train companies hated the fact that they had to have these two cars. It was very expensive. And so they thought that this was going to end that issue. It didn't. The Supreme Court went the other way and said separate but equal is now the law of the land. And that's where we get segregation, as a policy of the United States. And that goes on, that's in the 1890s, I think it's 1896, and that goes all the way to 1954 when Brown passes. Or not passes, but Brown comes down. But there's a couple of twists and turns. So what your family was doing by presenting that psychological evidence and the studies and so forth was giving the court a way to get there, because our country would still be in that separate but equal but for that, right? There were other cases that led up to Brown, and that's Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and they were going after various chinks in the armor, right? They said, oh, separate but equal? Yeah, you got the separate part, but the equal part, not so much, and that costs a lot of money. And so that's how they were going after this. But Brown in particular was the big one, because if you can keep me out of school, then I'm uneducated and you can subjugate me, right? Once I'm educated, now I'm dangerous. And so what I know about Brown is it was going to come out the other way.
That's correct.
The Supreme Court initially was going to say, yeah, separate but equal, just fine. This is 1954. So people who are thinking, oh, that was so long ago, no, it's not really, right? And people here remember their grandparents, and so their grandparents would remember their grandparents, and if you do that, someone alive now who's upward in age, who remembers their grandparent, who remembers their grandparent, there are people now, living now, who interacted with people that interacted with people in slavery. And so it wasn't that long ago. But those questions, I'm trying to link this up in my mind, those questions that your family answered, what happens is Brown's gonna come out the other way. It's gonna be separate but equal. I would not have gone to the white schools that I went to because my mother harangued basically the superintendent that I'm going to have 4 very intelligent, probably criminals, if I send them to the horrible schools in my neighborhood, so I need to get them out. So there's a story, and it may be apocryphal, but Justice Frankfurter, his clerks say that he said that Chief Justice Vinson dying was proof positive that there is, in fact, a God, because Chief Justice Vinson was just fine to say, yeah, separate but equal. Of course, we're not going to send these little black kids to school with our white children, right? That would sully them, and that just can't happen. And so before it actually gets argued twice. So I think what happened is they issued those because Chief Justice Earl Warren gets appointed. Earl Warren, they figure, I mean, everybody loves that guy, right? And they figure he's just going to rubber stamp and do what everybody else would have done. And he says, no, I'm not doing that. And that's when you start seeing the bumper stickers later, impeach Warren and what have you, because they're like, what? He comes in and he says, no, we're not going to do it this way. And he basically turns into the used car salesman of the Supreme Court. What's it going to take you to get, and what's it going to take to get you into this decision today? Because he knows it has to be unanimous. Because if you let the white portion of the country that's just very opposed to black people doing anything, if you let them have dissent among the Supreme Court, you're done, right? And so that is the second argument, I think, because what happens is they go back, they argue it again. It gives the newly appointed, after Justice Vinson dies, the newly appointed Warren an opportunity to lobby each justice one by one and say, this has to be unanimous. We are the Supreme Court. We have no army. We have no enforcement power, really. I mean, they kind of do, right? But you don't want to go there, right? And so this has to be us speaking with one voice. And I think that is the key that allows the Supreme Court to say, no, this stops here. Otherwise, 54 would have been just like 1896, would have been like 1996, would have been like now. We never would have gotten out of it. Or if we did, the longer you wait, the harder it gets. And so that was sort of a light bulb moment for me of that's how that happened. Because I know bits and pieces from other aspects, but to actually have someone who has a connection to the guy is astounding. So thank you.
No, thank you for sharing that important piece. I try to keep things high level because there's so much information, but everything you said is exactly correct. And in my grandfather's papers, when I go through it, he has it listed as Brown 2 in folders. So that was the second time it was argued. And yes, having that Supreme Court justice die actually worked in their favor. A big deal.
Is any other comments or questions in the audience? Anything, of interest to mention? Anything that struck a chord? Yeah, there we go.
Maybe this is too personal, but you have children. How do you raise your children with the difference in what history has given you?
I'd actually like to let my husband answer this question because I feel it's important for him because he is not Black, and I'm impressed with some of the things that he has done as an advocate.
Well, if you trace my Italian side all the way back, there's
The Moors, very true.
There's a little bit. So 23andMe's been very informative. Yeah, raising the kids, it's really, it's really, I'd say it's complex. You at our elementary school here in Simsbury, they go to Terrifil, and we had a situation where both of our kids are very light skinned, and we had a situation where my older son had mentioned that he was mixed race in his classroom, and the teacher didn't know how to respond and escalated it to the principal. And then the principal reached out to us to ask us, like, hey, you just want to make sure that he's not, talking with the other kids in the classroom. And is this in fact accurate? And it was a little interesting, not really because the school did anything wrong, or that my son did anything wrong by mentioning, but
I
something.
think the school could have handled it better.
Yeah. Okay. But what was really interesting is that there wasn't a mechanism in place. There was no education on the topic. If one of the kids had mentioned being homosexual, or if one of the kids had mentioned, another topic that was more observable about being, Black or Hispanic, and you could see that. It would have been treated a very different way, because we are now getting taught more and more about how to handle some of those situations. But in a mixed race situation, it's very, very challenging. And so we had to not only talk with the school, but also talk with our son about, this is something that you're going to experience. And our older, and I think, to your question specifically, like, how do we raise the kids? And I think it's a lot of it is, how do you identify? And I think just like anything in the world, you've kind of got to give the space for them to identify and understand their own history. And obviously Cassie's done an amazing job of kind of pulling together a lot of our family's history, but taking that a step further and giving them the space to identify, but then also realize that with that identification comes questions from other people. But that ended up being a positive, because a lot of people got education out of the scenario, and Cassie went and did a little session at the school and stuff like that, and my son was better off for it, and the school's better off for it. So I don't think there's any perfect answers for how we handle the situation in terms of raising the kids, but it's about asking them, how they feel and how they identify, and what pieces of their history are relevant and emotional and meaningful to them. So yeah, and then yeah, I picked most of that up in Parenting 101 class. I was actually curious if there was a third child on the way that I didn't know about, and I was like,
Thank God, no, it's not happening.
And yeah, so that was the main. When I saw that pop up, I was like, maybe I was traveling the last few days. Maybe we need to have a discussion about something. But so anyway, thanks everybody.
Thank you very much. I was just fascinated by all of it. I've been on my own journey for over the last 3 years, researching, chronicling some of my own family history, more in terms of the formation of my white identity and privilege as it paralleled racism. Some of the dates you had up there going back to the late 1800s and going forward. So many of the sort of markers that you had up there were ones that are familiar to me, and I could relate then to my own family history and where that all fit in. And I would just say, so all of that is leading. So in that initiative of mine, it's just the desire to kind of take responsibility for it, name it, understand it, take responsibility for it. So I would just suggest for the white people present, it's not just familiarizing ourselves with the Black history, but being curious about and being unafraid to examine our own as it weaves through identity, privilege, racism, all of it. And some people who I've shared my work with, like, oh my gosh, how did you find out all this stuff? Google it. It's amazing. I mean, you have family papers, I have some family papers, but there's so much there that you can just Google, and all you have to do is be curious.
Right. Thank you. Is there any other questions or commentary from the audience?
Really quickly, I just want to remind everybody to, before you leave, besides the beautiful ice cream that's waiting for you, to make sure you put your name on that sign-up list if you'd like to see the movie Origin for free at the Simsbury Apple Theater this Sunday, which is February 11th at 2 o'clock, and I promise you will be home in time to watch a Super Bowl if you're concerned about that. It will be over in time. Thank you all very, very much.
Just before we leave, I just wanted to say also, excuse me,
Carolyn
someone else
has a
had a,
question.
oh.
I just want to know if it's going to be streaming somewhere. Will it be available on YouTube or anyplace else?
I don't know. I know. So when I saw it originally, I saw it with Ava DuVernay, and she said that initially she had to deal with Netflix to do this. But when you work with a studio, they will tell you, she'll be like, hey, I want this person to be my lead. And they'll be like, no, they've never been a lead before. Hey, I want cast this person in this role. And then they'll say, no, they don't have a big enough social media following. And so to have creative freedom, she went and raised money from nonprofits to do this, which is why it's not in every theater right now. Like the Ford Foundation is, I know, one of the donors for it. So I don't know what's going to happen for streaming. I imagine that they will try to get it to be streaming. But this is a good opportunity now to see it for free and make sure you get the opportunity to see it close to home as well and not have to drive out to Plainville or something with the bigger theaters around.
So, yes. Oh, another comment?
I'm just wondering if any other tickets would be available if we wanted to go and bring our children or something like that on Sunday.
Put down your phone number and information, because if we have extra tickets and we don't hit the 70 threshold, I'm happy to give more out to people. So just make a note or something when you sign up.
So just again, thank you. And just before we depart, again, this is a Black History Month celebration. And even in the midst of speaking about caste, and even there's the work of the NAACP working with the Supreme Court. And so there's multiple levels, that are working. And sometimes I enjoy this conversation because you kind of hear what was happening on a higher level, working with the government and academia. And a lot of times, my focus with the Brown versus Board of Education is like, even after the law was passed, like somebody had to step into one of those schools, and so that's one of the things I'm always, careful to mention, is the bravery that it took to break these ceilings, to open these doors, the threats. One of the letter you're reading about someone was voting in Virginia, and so in the back of my head, that's like someone's risking their life, and then there's the talk about the mother as a tigress. So I could picture her instilling this toughness, into your great uncle for him to understand that it's going to take to stand up, when many people would stand up and they could be hanging from a tree, as a result. And so there's just these different, levels of strength that it takes. There's the academia area of strength to want to study, to be a valedictorian. There's the strength that it's going to take to send a 6-year-old girl into a school, in first grade in New Orleans and have to risk what she has to risk. So every level, every step of the way is a part of what I enjoy, about speaking about my history is the strength, it's the faith, it's the perseverance, it's the resilience. And so one thing I always talk about when we talk about human character and human attributes are the attributes that it took to survive, to endure, and still to be able to thrive here in America. So those are all attributes that I always, the human attributes that it takes, to be able to to make it through this type of trauma. And so that's what I always like to, to highlight, even in a classroom. But these are some of the best human attributes that we're looking at and what it took to survive in this through all the obstacles, all the oppression, all the violence, everything, and all the trauma. And so these are things that we acknowledge. This is a human story, right? It's human overcoming and it's human redemption as well. And so this is just another highlight of it. And then it connects into so many other areas. And so when we think about it, it's American history. It's the story of America. It's African American history. It's African history. There's the Confederate soldiers and a black woman having 5 kids. There's so many layers, that happens in this story. And so that's what I say, just be able to grasp something out of all this, and then hopefully be able to continue, this conversation. But this is the point of why we have to have these discussions. My son, Josiah, it's his birthday. Josiah, raise your hand if you don't mind. But he has to do a little report on Dr. King, and he's talking about segregation and racism. And he said, I want to take my hair out like Colin Kaepernick, right? And so I was like, that's cool. Well, I was reading his report, but I asked him, where's the part about discrimination or racism today? And he's like, I really don't know about it. And so I said, well, how come Colin Kaepernick's not in the NFL anymore? And that's something that he's a little bit able, to relate to a little bit more on that level. But, these are that's my wife, Grace. These are our sons are here. And we live in Hartford. Our kids come to school here, and thank you, Tanisha. Come to school up here, but you don't necessarily want to. How can I say? Like, you don't want to put a big cloud, on his mind, because we want him to do his best, to be his best, and that's what all of our kids. I hope we want the same, for everyone. But there's still the realities of what we're dealing with, here, and there's issues in schools, elementary schools, high schools, but. This is a big way for us to be able to continue to move forward. There's discussion, and then we continue to do this type of work. So we just want to thank you all, for coming out this evening, and partaking and listening, and then adding to the discussion in different levels as well. So everyone has a little bit, to add to it. So again, we want to say thank you. I don't know, Nicole, if you came up to say a word, and this is just okay in regards to the Human Library. So if you want to speak about that. But again, thank you. This is Nicole Kodak, and so let her speak about the Human Library.
I will always give my microphone to Nkosi, and he knows that he is so gifted, and we are lucky to have him as part of our group. Before you leave tonight, I just want to tell you our next event. We are with the Simsbury Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Council, and on March 23rd, it's a Saturday, right here at this library, on this level, from 10 to 2, we're going to have our first human library. I've been trying to do this for 2 years, so we're pretty excited. This is an organization in Denmark that has been doing this for 20 years in 85 countries. And what it is a chance to unjudge someone. And that the books in the human library are human beings who are willing to bravely share their story. They don't do a presentation. They don't prepare anything. We prepare them to have a conversation and let the reader, with curiosity, ask the questions and lead the discussion. So we have 13 books that are going to be humans, that are going to be willing to share their stories. And it'll be in small groups of 1 or 2 with each book. And we'll have probably 4 or 5 rounds of this. So you can check out multiple titles if you want to come. The stories range from a teenage Jewish immigrant from the USSR, someone who ran away from home and grew up homeless, someone who is a drag performer, someone our local farmer. We have, I'm trying to think of some of the other titles. We have 14 books in total, someone who's HIV positive. These are people who live in a different situation that you can't always tell by looking at them, but they're willing to share and answer questions so that we can understand the dignity and the life of somebody who's different from us. And it's free and open to the public, and I would just love you to invite anyone that you know to come. We're hoping to do it every year. The best part of my life right now, well, that's not fair. I love my family. The really exciting part of my life is when I get to talk to all these different people and hear a little bit about their stories and let them express that they're bravely interested in being part of this. So if you're interested, this is going to happen Saturday, March 23rd. Carol. There will be some snacks. The books will be fed lunch in a private room, but there will be snacks. And by the way, I do want to clarify one thing because it would make me feel very uncomfortable. The ice cream that we got from the Black-owned ice cream dairy bar, Frisbee's Dairy Bar, we paid for. I don't want you to think we got it for free to bring it to a white town. That would be a no-no. So thank you for coming and listening to this amazing story. Thank you for telling your story again. I love when you do this. Thank you, Nkosi, so much.
Funding for Simsbury Community Television is provided in part by contributions from viewers like you. Thank you.